Are we approaching a trade war on the moon? Some predictions say we're just decades away from a global battle for lunar resources. Right now, shared science seems to be the common interest, but with no clear legal framework to determine who has the right to take what, do our leaders need to devise a fair, conflict-free way to colonize outer space? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. The full-on space race we'll remember from the Cold War may have cooled down over the decades, but recently it's warmed up again. Between the US, India, China, Russia, and Japan and Israel, there's an arguably healthy competition to explore the moon and share the collected data. But as space exploration becomes more affordable for governments and privately owned corporations, inevitable questions of who has the right to land where and take what from our planetary neighbor are fueling debate. Here's a look.
5, 4, 3.
It's been 55 years since the USA's Apollo 11 mission landed astronauts on the moon for the first time. In the decades since, Russia, China, Japan, and India have landed spacecraft on the lunar surface, with many focused on bringing back samples. 6 of NASA's Apollo missions alone returned nearly 400 kilograms of moon rock to Earth. And what scientists have found is that the moon contains extremely valuable resources, including rare earth elements, minerals such as titanium, and highly valuable amounts of helium-3, which it's hoped can be used for nuclear fusion. The helium-3 alone has been valued at $1.5 quadrillion. China's latest mission, Chang'e 6, has for the first time landed on the far side of the moon and safely transferred lunar samples to a craft that will return to Earth in the coming days. And with the age of commercial lunar flight getting underway, private companies are planning to send dozens of probes to survey the moon's surface in the approaching years. But the coming astronomical clash of countries and companies is being carried out in a legal no man's land. There are several global agreements governing space, there are even space lawyers, but none of them deal with territorial sovereignty. The Outer Space Treaty, which was drafted during the Cold War and signed by over 100 countries, including the US, China, and Russia, states outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty.
It states that it should be for the benefit of all mankind, and it sets out important principles such as non-appropriation. So whether you put up a flag, whether you do anything, you build anything, you just don't have property rights over the moon.
But when it comes to harvesting resources from the moon, things get much more complicated. A company or country that sets up any future mining operation is essentially claiming that land as their own. And with major spacefaring countries all planning to establish bases on the moon, space lawyers are set for a busy time. The latest effort to police the lunar Wild West came from NASA in 2020. The Artemis Accords were written in what NASA says is the hope of creating a transparent environment to allow exploration, science, and commercial activities for all of humanity to enjoy. But China and Russia have not signed up and are unlikely to do so, believing that any future treaty should be made at the United Nations. Astronomers are also sounding the alarm bells, describing the issue as increasingly urgent. An unrestricted rush for resources could cause irreparable damage to scientific research sites.
Looking to the future, many see significant potential in resources to be found on celestial bodies, such as the moon, planets, and asteroids. However, without agreed international principles governing space resource activities, there is a risk of conflict, of environmental degradation, and of increased inequalities in perhaps the not too distant future, given how fast we have seen technology advancing.
There are only a handful of sites on the moon that are suitable for bases or mines. They need to be areas that contain water, and those sites are extremely valuable for scientists studying space. So given humankind's track record of exploitation and mining on our own Earth, is the legal vacuum surrounding the moon's resources set to end in global conflict?
So 55 years after Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, are we looking at a more commercially driven space race between global powers? And what would that mean for our planet and our moon? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from London, research fellow in ethics at King's College and author of Nobody Owns the Moon, Tony Milligan. From Oxford, Mississippi, executive director at the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi and president of For All Moonkind, Michelle Hanlon. And from Tucson, Arizona, astronomer and assistant director for government relations at the Steward Observatory, Richard Green. Thanks all so much for being with me. Let's first establish how much this is actually worth talking about right now, because, to the layman, this all still sounds rather science fiction, fodder for Hollywood rather than reality. So Richard Green, is another more commercially driven space race closer than we think?
Oh, I believe so. There is significant interest in mining resources. When we hear the talk from national space agencies, they really see the moon as the Earth's spaceport for further human exploration of the solar system. And so there is a lot of commercially driven opportunity. And the commercial world is racing to launch and place their payloads on the moon with the backing of national governments in many cases.
And what do you think that means? I mean, could it get ugly, or do you think this could happen in a more civilized manner, let's put it this way, even with, potentially billions, if not trillions of dollars in revenue at stake?
So there is always the potential for international cooperation, and that's why a number of us go to the United Nations and try to say, this is the perfect time to start creating some rules for coordination and cooperation on the moon. From my narrow perspective as a scientist, there are unique scientific opportunities on the moon that we need to reserve now before commercial activities start in the same places. And I'm happy to talk about that a little more later.
Yeah, I do want to get to that, what needs to be protected. But let me ask Tony Milligan if you're on the same page there, and what needs to be understood before serious resource exploration and rights claiming, gets underway.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. The moon is a gateway to the rest of the solar system. It's the gateway to Mars and to the asteroid belt where the big resources are, the big commercially important resources. But that doesn't mean to say that the moon is not going to be mined for various things. Helium-3, one thinks of as an obvious resource that could be used to help power the move beyond the cislunar space, that Earth-Moon system, and to actually get us out to the towards Mars and the asteroid belt. But nobody owns the moon. Nobody's allowed to claim ownership of the entirety of the moon or a portion of the moon. But that doesn't mean to say that there can't be systems which will allow for moon operations and moon mining. But when that goes on, we have to make sure that there is something like the equivalent of national parks on the moon. We have to make sure that the science is protected and that we have areas that are designated in the moon that we just don't go anywhere near and that we don't touch.
Right. I mean, Michelle, we can say nobody owns the moon, but in the end, the legislation kind of has to be there. The international law framework has to be there in this space. Do you think it's there, Michelle? Or might we actually just be jumping ahead in a way that could damage that scientific discovery people are talking about and the moon's environment as well, similar to what we've done on Earth?
So I think it's really important. I'm going to push back a little bit because I think it's not that nobody owns the moon. I think it's that everybody owns the moon. And I think we have to really take into this concept of stewardship, of responsibility, and look at the moon not as some object that, it's just there. Nobody can do anything about it. We can do a lot about it. And as Richard pointed out, we try through the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. However, I want to be very clear. The people going to the moon right now are not looking at it for billions and billions of dollars. What are we looking for on the moon? Right now, fundamentally, we're looking for water, which sounds really silly because it's fairly abundant here on Earth. But we need to find that water in order to support communities on the moon and in order to get beyond. So the moon is a gateway, but we need to find and mine and figure out how to literally extract water from dirt. So we have a little window of time here to get in the regulations that we need to make sure that we're not all fighting for that little patch of water that we don't even know for sure, but we think exists in the lunar South Pole.
Okay, but if that just creeps up on us, Michelle, and the water is suddenly discovered via even the Chinese mission that's coming back soon with some rock samples, just for example, hypothetically, this could jump ahead very quickly, could it not? And there is commercial interest because that is why these commercial operations like Elon Musk's is already talking about landing, tourists basically on other planets if possible. Go ahead.
Absolutely. There is absolutely a commercial interest. And I didn't mean to suggest there wasn't. I'm just saying we're not looking at that billion-dollar win. And what the issue here again is that where we are all headed back, commercial interests as well as national interests, to the same place on the moon. And so the conflict is going to arise when, for example, somebody gets to the moon first and says, oh, hey, I'm not claiming ownership, I'm not claiming property, but I'm here, so don't interrupt what I'm doing. And then another nation or another commercial entity comes along and says, well, you can't own that, so I'm going to plop down right next to you and mine that same, well of water. And that's where we're going to see the conflict come up.
Okay. Richard, then talk about the potential scientific and ecological risks of us being there on the moon. We know what exploration of our own planet has done, i.e. introducing destructive alien species and driving plants and animals into extinction. So could the moon be in for the same?
It's hard to say, and that's why we require this international planning. But what we do know is that there are deep craters near the pole of the moon, both poles, that have been in permanent shadow since the moon was formed. And so the ices in the floors of those craters are pristine material that have encoded the history of the solar system, the bombardment, the delivery of organic molecules and prebiotic molecules, ones that could develop into life. And so our colleagues who do that kind of science want very strongly to sample that material first before other human activity gets going and the water is extracted to help thirsty humans in their space base or to develop rocket fuel. So our compressed statement is you can always sample first and mine later, but you can't do it the other way around. So setting up an international order that allows the scientific sampling of these critical areas is really important to have this unique history of our solar system.
And do you think all the competitors involved understand that they need to be patient, they need to let scientists do the work first, and that if they don't, they might think they're jumping the competition line, but they could cause serious damage?
That's the world we would like to create. And at the moment, I think there is a very strong competition to get going at the commercial level to use the moon, as Tony said, for setting up our local spaceport. And so we are trying to spread that message that there is some critical science that needs to be done in certain places first. The burden on our community is to decide which of those craters and which of those ices are the highest priority for sampling. Get up there, get in, get out, and learn that material, learn what we need to learn.
So Tony, talk to us. Oh, go ahead, Michelle. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the biggest issues is understanding who gets to make those decisions. And I very much sympathize with the scientists. But if you are an entrepreneur, you want to get there. I think the best example is when Chandrayaan was headed for the South Pole of the moon, and Russia jumped in and said, "Oh, well, we can get there first." And all of a sudden, Russia's just sending something that ended up crash landing on the moon. We have this sense of, I've got to be there first. I've got to get there first. And I don't think that we have any sensibility about what that means. We're just junking up the moon right now, trying, because the last, we've had 2 commercial missions that crash landed. And again,
Yeah.
space is hard. We need to keep trying, but we're going to start having a lot of junk on the moon that's going to interrupt both scientific research and commercial exploration.
Right. I mean, it really is it not, Tony, to say this is so similar a time right now to when the first explorers were looking at our actual planet, not knowing necessarily if the world was flat or round, and taking with them, foreign species to lands from over in North America or Southern Africa, for example, and actually destroying entire environments, cutting down trees. We don't know at this point what we're in for. And watching this kind of clumsy behavior with, crash landing certain rockets just because I want to get there first could really potentially destroy certain things going forward.
Okay, there's a serious source of concern, which is that there's a lot of competition for the strategic resources and for the key sites, both at the South Lunar Pole, in terms of those water ice and volatiles and the permanently exposed areas that get continuous sunlight, which is great for energy. So that's down at the South Lunar Pole, and also on the lunar far side as well, which will be great for setting up telescopic arrays. But at the same time, while scientists want to do that, the lunar far side has probably got higher density of helium-3, and so commercial and mining interests would be more interested in developing those areas as well. So there's a legitimate concern about the kinds of things that we do. And then there's something else, which is a politically driven narrative about colonialism and the idea that somehow this is just an extension of colonialism, and we're going to be doing exactly the same kinds of things to the moon, to Mars, that we did on Earth. And even if somebody or a group of people in the room wanted to do that, it would not be practical. It fails to take account of just how different and unique and specific a place the moon is, and how unique and specific a place Mars is. We simply cannot behave in the ways that we have done elsewhere.
But do we know any other way?
Yeah. Well,
especially since we don't truly understand what is on the surface of either planet.
Well, we've got a pretty good idea about that, and the circumstances of the moon and of Mars, they encourage competition, but they also encourage cooperation as well. Especially if you're talking about missions that involve actual human beings, there's so little support there in terms of infrastructure for rescue and considerations of that sort, that there's an international mutual interdependence. And one can see that in terms of what happens in space generally and what happens on Earth, even when you have the big build-up in political and military tensions. Those do feed through into what happens in space, but often you'll find a level of continuity in the cooperation in space because the sheer physical circumstances force that upon you.
Okay. Michelle, let me ask you this, because what some find really fascinating is that there are already space lawyers in existence. What then are they defending right now? And I mean, can they really exist just off the back of the only treaty we seem to have, which is the Outer Space Treaty written, decades ago? And can that treaty somehow function the same as the law of the sea, even, which many say has disappointed a lot of mankind? Go ahead.
Absolutely. So yes, there are a lot of us space lawyers out there, and we have a very important job. So there's 2 types of us. One are the commercial space lawyers, and they're dealing with radio frequency and telecommunication satellites, because people don't realize how much we depend on orbiting satellites for the comforts of our daily lives. But then there's this extension and these space lawyers thinking about lunar governance and frameworks for communities living in space, resource utilization and sharing of benefits. This treaty from the 1950s and 60s first started to be negotiated in the 50s and ratified in 1967. It's a very sort of pie in the sky inspirational treaty. And when you think about it, you think about how we were in the middle of a Cold War. So it's really a disarmament treaty. There's a huge difference between the Outer Space Treaty and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The Outer Space Treaty is literally 2 pages long. The UN close is hundreds and hundreds of pages. So we're looking at one treaty, the Law of the Sea, that was trying to codify centuries of tradition and saying, this is how we treat each other in the sea. We're just going to make the rules and set them in stone. The Outer Space Treaty is just sort of like, oh, wow, woohoo, we're going to this whole new realm. How are we going to interact? We have no idea. The one thing they did was they realized we cannot make rules of the road because we don't know what that road looks like. It's like Terry said, we have no idea. Space is trying to kill all of us. And so how are we going to manage that? And so we have this treaty that is very inspirational. Space is the province of all humankind. We're going to explore space, but we're going to share the benefits of space with all states. We're not going to put nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in space, and we cannot claim territory in space. And so these are sort of the only guidelines that we have.
Okay. Richard, let me ask you this, just to kind of give our audience a little more perspective of the timing of all this. How far are we from seeing an actual moon base? I don't know if the Artemis 3 would qualify, where humans can actually stay and work for an extended period of time. So back to landing a man on the moon, but this time staying for a while.
Right. And I know that, the Artemis program in the U.S. is really pushing toward setting up that manned-human presence. There are a lot of details that need to be attended to. We have been extraordinarily lucky in our human exploration of the moon to date because the sun is a real powerhouse, and every once in a while it expels a massive blob of charged plasma and with high energy particles in it. And those are actually a lethal dose of radiation to humans. So for an extended presence on the moon, it's different from Apollo astronauts who were there for a little bit of time and then left and got back. To stay for months requires some serious shielding of some sort, either tunneling deep into the lunar rock or devising structures of lightweight material that are extraordinarily thick in order to protect humans. So people who are working on the Gateway will already say, we just hope that we are lucky, and they are putting the human habitation part next to the water on the Gateway so that there's a little bit of shielding if one of those flares comes. But there are serious issues about preservation of human life that need to be addressed before a long-term sustainable human presence can actually happen on the surface.
Okay. Let me finish then with Tony quickly. It's kind of a lengthier question, but I want to talk a little bit more about what resources really are there that could prove, hyper valuable. Apparently, moon dust can be used to produce cell phones, the other platinum group metals. There's the helium-3 you mentioned, which can fuel nuclear fusion and clean energy. Would something like that be worth a lot of investment in mining? And how bad do you think that competition could get? I know you say no one owns the moon, but when it comes to resources, mining firms can get very aggressive.
No, I don't think that there's enough helium-3, there's enough of the kinds of resources that we value to create any kind of gold rush on the moon. It is the function of the moon in terms of that gateway to get to the places where we can access these things. That's the bigger ball game, to be able to get out to the asteroid belt to mine those platinum group metals.
Okay.
But within that process, the moon occupies a strategic position, and Mars occupies a strategic position. Mars is where you would have a base for the mining of the asteroid belt, and the lunar resources are the resources that you would hope to utilize in order to make access to the belt practical.
Okay, Michelle, just quickly, would you agree with Tony that you don't expect to see the proverbial gold rush?
I agree that we're looking at the moon strategically. So what we're going to see in our gold rush is not the rush to actually mine and bring stuff back, but it's going to be the ones to get there and be able to use the regolith to make habitats. You know, think about people going, explorers going. They want bread. They want bakeries. They're going to need water. They're going to need blue jeans. And so these commercial entities are going to be racing to the moon to be the suppliers for the people going on beyond the lunar surface.
Okay, Michelle Hanlon, that will have to be the final word. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.